why can't I just be grossed out by sharing a private space with a man? Like, no, you don't, I don't have to, explain that to you in some way. I don't need some trauma to say no to you in my bathroom or my locker room or, my hospital, something I'm going to be doing where I want a woman there doing whatever that needs to be done, not a man.
Yeah, I agree. That's a good point. Women should not have to dig up some horrible example of trauma in order to justify it. And I've seen the same thing. Some people were saying, like, well, can you think of a specific example of a trans identified male in a bathroom that's caused problems? And I'm like, why should we have to wait for it to cause problems before we can justify preserving female
Exactly.
spaces? Don't we have a right to female only spaces? Why is the burden on us to defend that? It seems completely unfair. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the LGB Alliance USA News Roundup for the week ending in November 22nd, 2024. First, a summary of the news. A Christian high school in the Bay Area forfeits a girls' volleyball match over the inclusion of a trans identified male. A Korean spa in Washington state fights in court to stay female only. University of Maine professor Christy Hammer was formally vindicated of charges of gender identity discrimination. World Athletics president Lord Coe stands up for women's single-sex sports. Antifa clashes with WDI at an event in a Seattle library. And Republican Congresswoman Nancy Mace fights for female-only bathrooms. So first, we're going to start with Northern California. Stone Ridge Christian High School announced last Friday that it is forfeiting Saturday's CIF State NorCal Division 6 semifinal match against San Francisco Waldorf because of a trans-identified male player, citing religious conviction that God makes people either male or female. They also cited, quote, duty and responsibility to care for the health and safety of our athletes. Stone Ridge Christian's decision was criticized by Equality California, an LGBTQ plus activist organization, accusing them of quote unquote divisive and hateful rhetoric. On the other hand, the San Francisco Bay Area based women's group Women Are Real, which supports the rights of women and girls to single sex sports teams, applauded Stone Ridge's forfeit as groundbreaking. Women Are Real went on to explain how it has been very hard to find any school willing to forfeit over this issue in the San Francisco Bay Area, including religious schools. The only exception was a Muslim school that forfeited in January of this year, but they did not release any public statements. For Stone Ridge Christian to forfeit and publicly announce their forfeit is indeed groundbreaking in a part of the country famous for its progressive politics. That said, as we keep emphasizing, supporting single-sex athletics should not be viewed as a left versus right issue, nor is it anti-gay as much as TQ plus activists try to frame it as such. According to a survey, 65% of Women Are Real members are Democrats, 56% are former athletes, and 45% are lesbian or bisexual. Now, taking it up to Washington State, there's a traditional Korean spa called Olympia Spa in Washington State that is fighting to stay women only. The Korean treatment, called Setshin, is a body scrub that requires the women receiving it to be nude, and after an intact trans-identified male was barred entry in 2022, the spa advertised on its website that, quote-unquote, biological women are welcome. Men who have had their genitalia removed are also welcome. In late 2022, after the man filed a complaint, the Human Rights Commission of Washington issued a complaint of discrimination based on this denial of service and the new website language. After hearing arguments, the commission determined the spa violated state discrimination laws with its policy and website language. Under the Washington law against discrimination, places of public accommodation are barred from restricting customers based on their gender identity. The Christian owners of the spa, who believe only married men should see women nude, filed a federal lawsuit against the state of Washington claiming violation of association and free speech. This lawsuit was originally dismissed. Olympia Spa appealed the dismissal, and on November 18th, a three-judge panel of the Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit took up the appeal. Kevin Snyder of the conservative Pacific Justice Institute, who is representing the spa, argued that the customers, that is, nude women and girls aged 13 and older, are not, quote, publicly available goods or services that males are entitled to view when females do not consent, end quote. U.S. Circuit Judge Mary Margaret McEwen, a Bill Clinton appointee, questioned Snyder about the spa's admittance policy. It's not really biological women are welcome, McEwen said. It means non-biological women are not welcome. I mean, that's the reality. Later, McEwen questioned Snyder on the right to freedom of association, noting that the spa's policy seems, quote, quite parallel to those failed attempts to restrict customers based on race. So, if you have public accommodation, can you say no blacks? McEwen said. That's associational. Neil Luna, Assistant Attorney General, represented the state of Washington and argued that the spa did not have the right to restrict its customers, noting, quote, public businesses cannot pick and choose their customers based on a protected class, end quote, Luna said. U.S. Circuit Judge Kenneth Lee, a Donald Trump appointee, considered his own experience as a child in Korea at a men's-only spa and responded to Snyder's claim that the spa should be considered more on the order of a private club. Maybe it's not like a private club, but on the other hand, it's not a commercial transaction, Lee said, and went on to say, there's something very intimate about the experience. And then Luna goes on to say, referring to men who wish to enter this women-only space, there is a humiliation and there is a loss of dignity and harm that the state has an interest in protecting. The panel did not indicate when it would rule. Now, I think it's ludicrous to compare sex segregation to race segregation, as Judge McEwen has done. While segregating by race is due to unjust prejudice, segregating by sex has a legitimate basis in safety. Echoing Judge Lee, there is an intimacy involved in a spa environment, much like a restroom or locker room, that makes it understandable why women would not want men present. And I think forcing this spa to admit males who identify as women present a safeguarding nightmare. Virtually any man could call himself a woman to gain access to a woman's spa, and no gender identity, no matter how strongly held, can override biology. Let's respect safety, privacy, and boundaries. Now moving to the East Coast, University of Maine professor Christy Hammer has been cleared by the Maine Human Rights Commission of any wrongdoing stemming from a complaint from non-binary student Elizabeth Leibiger. During a graduate-level education class in 2022, education professor Dr. Christy Hammer stated that there are only two sexes, along with a vanishingly small number of intersex people born with defects in their sexual development. Leibiger claimed that this statement, as well as Dr. Hammer referring to her by the pronoun she, constituted discrimination on the basis of gender identity and contributed to a hostile work environment. But the Maine Human Rights Commission determined that Dr. Hammer did not discriminate against Leibiger on the basis of gender identity. Though the report was published in August, Dr. Hammer has only recently gone public with her reaction. We would like to congratulate Dr. Hammer on her vindication, and we applaud her persistence in remaining true to her convictions and belief in biological reality. I have personally met Dr. Hammer, and I find her to be a very kind and thoughtful woman, not the kind of person I can imagine would be a hateful and impulsive firebrand. The fact that she, of all people, would be accused of bigotry just goes to show how absurd and desperate trans activists can get. Her win is a victory for free speech and critical thinking, and we hope it sets a good precedent for academic freedom going forward. Now, what do you have, Carol?
Thanks, Ariane. So the World Athletic President, Lord Coe, told BBC sports editor Dan Roan that the International Olympic Committee, IOC, needs to improve its rules on transgender athletes and athletes with differences in sex development, DSD. They need to do this, he said, to protect female sports. Lord Coe is one of 7 confirmed candidates to replace the IOC's outgoing president, Thomas Bach. Coe also said, quote, I think the International Olympic Committee needs a very, very clear policy in this space. And the protection of the female category for me is absolutely non-negotiable. If you are not prepared to do that, and that is where the international federations expect a lead to be taken, then you really will lose female sports, and I'm not prepared to see that happen, end quote. In Seattle, on September 17th, Antifa targeted the U.S. chapter of Women's Declaration International panel discussion at their public library. The discussion was called Standing Up for Women and Girls in Washington. The demonstrators, including Antifa, chanted, quote, money for jobs and education, not police intimidation, end quote. The Seattle PD held off Antifa's attempt to climb the building and enter the library. Prior to the event, directors of Capitol Hill Pride and Linwood Pride, Charlotte Lefevre and Philip Lipson, sent an email on November 6 to Seattle Public Library Mayor Bruce Harrell and the Seattle City Council calling for the cancellation of the meeting. The South Seattle Emerald, a local paper, obtained the email chain between Lefevre and Lipson and Tom Fay, Executive Director and Chief Librarian. Quote, this is from the email. We highly encourage the library to cancel hosting any meetings as we feel the protest of this meeting will be too disruptive to the city and the community. The email goes on. It should be acknowledged there are plenty of free speech venues available to WDI, including the internet. So the library should not feel they are required to rent a library auditorium, and we feel this meeting violates the library's commitment to the city of Seattle and the state of Washington to uphold and support diversity. End quote. Women's Liberation International, WDI, is a radical feminist organization working for the liberation of women and girls and fighting hard to regain a safeguarding and women-only spaces. Now, news out of the Capitol. Republican Representative Nancy Mace out of South Carolina has introduced a resolution to ensure that restrooms, locker rooms, and other private spaces at the Capitol stay sex segregated. This came after a trans-identified man, Sarah McBride, Democrat out of Delaware, was elected to Congress. House Speaker Mike Johnson announced his support for the resolution in a statement, quote, all single-sex facilities in the Capitol and House office buildings, such as restrooms, changing rooms, and locker rooms, are reserved for individuals of that biological sex, end quote, adding, quote, women deserve women-only spaces, end quote. Nancy Mace has come under fire as being anti-LGBTQ, but her voting record does not reflect this. In 2022, she broke with majority of the Republican Party to support the Respect for Marriage Act. She has also said in interviews that she supports LGBT rights. It's almost like Nancy understands that same-sex rights and men wanting into women's spaces are totally different issues. We will keep an eye on this story and report any new information to you all. So Ariane, what do you think about this story? It's been a hot one.
Yeah, and I've been following it on X, and when I first heard that she was doing this, my first reaction was, okay, where is she coming from? What sort I heard she was a Republican. I thought, okay, is she coming from a more religious right perspective? Is she just sort of like crazy MAGA, whatever? I don't know. There are a lot of ways this could play out, but it sounds like, from what I can tell, she has maybe more of a libertarian streak on some issues. Like, she's like you were saying, that she supports same-sex marriage. There are some other things too, just reading about her background. She seems to be sort of pro marijuana legalization. She apparently at one point worked for Ron Paul or had supported Ron Paul, who was kind of a more of a libertarian Republican. So it sounds like she's kind of her own person who is not part of
Yeah,
some sort
I
of
mean, she sounds moderate, right? Like she
yeah.
sounds, yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem from what I've read, it doesn't seem that she's coming at this from like a Christian religious perspective. It seems like she's coming at this just from a woman's perspective. I mean,
Yeah, and she was the first woman to be admitted to the Citadel Military Academy, and there was, a whole brouhaha about that back in the day about whether women should be allowed in the Citadel, and there were definitely some conservatives who did not think they should be allowed. So I'm happy to see this. I'm happy, and also on X, she's been openly supportive of recognizing like LGBT rights and saying how, there have been lesbians who agree with her. I've been very happy to see that.
well, honestly, I think she does support LGBT rights. She supports the rights of someone who's identifies as transgender to not be discriminated against, as we all do, right? But the difference is, um, wanting to go into a space where you do not belong is not a right. Like that's where we split here, and it's been it seems like she understands that, and that's really cool to see. It's been interesting to read the more liberal leaning mainstream papers and news articles and stuff on this, because they have to say, I mean, that she did support the same-sex marriage, act. Like her voting record shows this, and then they go on to be like, we just don't understand why she doesn't support this other issue. And it's like, yes, like let's start to break that up, people. Why do you think she's not supporting this other issue? Because it's not an LGBTQ right thing.
Hmm. And I think it's part of the strategy of these LGBTQ plus activists to package everything together deliberately to create this confusion.
Exactly, it's to create chaos. It absolutely is.
Yeah, and so I hope at least some people are finally gonna see that it's a lot more complicated than that. Not to, you
I mean,
know.
I think, I mean, she is Republican, right? So a lot of folks are just gonna dismiss her out of hand for that. However, she does have the voting record of supporting
Mhm.
gay rights, right? So you can't dismiss that. Obviously, if a Democrat woman was to step up, that would be mind blowing. I'm sure she would lose everything, but I mean, that obviously would be, something we really need to see. I hope we see it pretty soon. I mean, maybe the ball's rolling here.
Mhm. And I'm curious to see too what other sort of plans of action, other issues Nancy Mace is going to take up in the future. I mean, there's a lot of things that could be done on the gender front in this next, session of Congress. And is she going to take a leadership role in some, maybe on the medical issue or uh,
Yeah.
how far, even with the bathroom issue, like how we just talking about like federal buildings, just the Capitol, there's a lot of ways this can go. So I'm curious to see if she's going to emerge as a leader on this issue going into the future.
That would be interesting. I mean, maybe she's decided, oh, I'm going to take up this fight. I mean, maybe that's kind of one of the good things is because she is a Republican, maybe she can kind of take this up and be ensure that she's not going to be kicked out of her party and lose everything. I
Right.
mean, that's the sad reality we're at right now is, the left has totally shut down any discussion on this or any difference of opinion.
Hmm. And at least, insofar as Republicans go, as we were saying, it's going to be much harder to paint her as some religious right nut job. So,
Yeah. I mean, they try, but man, it's hard. And that's that cognitive dissonance, right? It has to sneak in there. You have to kind of break people up a little bit and go, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Let's think about it. I'm a woman, I'm a lesbian. I don't want to share a space with a man. There's lots of us that don't. This is not a gay issue. This is not a LGBT issue. It is a absolute women's issue.
one point I told people recently is I have to admit that I didn't used to think the bathroom issue was so important. Like, I thought that, of all the gender ideology things, I thought that was like, yeah, not something I cared about. But what really changed my mind was talking to women who were victims or survivors of sexual assault or stalking or something like that, and how for them single sex restrooms is just really important for their safety, for their psychological and their physical safety. And that made me really respect the importance of this issue. And I believe, didn't Nancy Mace say she was some sort of like sexual assault?
I saw that floating around on Twitter, but I don't know for sure. I didn't find an actual like quote from her that I saw.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious if that might have informed the extent to which she
But
really.
I also like I understand that perspective, but I don't like I have never been sexually assaulted, but I still like why can't I just be grossed out by sharing a private space with a man? Like no, you don't I don't have to explain that to you in some way. I don't need some trauma to say no to you in my bathroom or my locker room or, my hospital something I'm going to be doing where it's got to I want a woman there doing whatever that needs to be done, not a man.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree. That's a good point. Women should not have to dig up some horrible example of trauma in order to justify it. And I've seen the same thing. Some people were saying, like, well, can you think of a specific example of a trans identified male in a bathroom that's caused problems? And I'm like, why should we have to wait for it to cause problems before we can justify preserving
Exactly.
female-only spaces? Don't we have a right to female-only spaces? Why is the burden on us to defend that? It seems completely unfair.
Yeah, I agree. So I'm curious to see where this goes.
Absolutely. I'm curious to see where it goes too. And on that note, that's all for this week's news roundup. We're taking a break next week, so we hope to see you again in 2 weeks when we hope to update you about the Scrimeti hearings at the Supreme Court. In the meantime, happy Thanksgiving, everyone.